I still remember the weight of that moment, how it settled into my chest like something I'd been carrying for years without knowing. It was past midnight, maybe closer to 1, and the house had that particular stillness that comes when everyone else has surrendered to sleep. The kitchen felt larger in the darkness. The familiar shapes of counters and cabinets transformed into something foreign, almost sacred. The only light came from the small lamp above the sink, casting everything in warm amber, and the only sounds are the refrigerator's low mechanical hum and the soft clink of my spoon against the porcelain mug. I was making tea I didn't want, stirring honey I couldn't taste. My sleeves were rolled up to my elbows, my feet bare against the cool tile floor. The ritual of it had become automatic over the past few weeks. Whenever sleep eluded me, I'd find myself here, going through these motions as if they might somehow anchor me to something solid. But nothing felt solid anymore. Everything that had once seemed permanent in my life now felt provisional, temporary, like a stage set that could be struck and rearranged at any moment. Owen was leaning against the counter across from me, his presence both casual and electric. He'd come by earlier that evening to return a book, some novel about memory and loss that we'd spent an hour discussing over dinner. Clara had taken Naomi to her mother's for the weekend, something about helping with his estate sale, and the house had felt too quiet, too full of unspoken thoughts. When Owen knocked on the door, just after 9, holding the book and wearing that slightly lopsided smile that had become dangerously familiar, I'd invited him in without hesitation. One cup of coffee had led to another, then to opening a bottle of wine neither of us really wanted, and somewhere along the way, we'd started laughing. The laughter had begun over something ridiculous, a story Owen told about his first week in town, when he'd mistaken the hardware store owner for the mayor and spent 10 minutes earnestly discussing municipal water pressure with a man who just wanted to sell him a wrench. But it had evolved into something deeper, the kind of shared hilarity that feeds on itself, where each new detail sends you both further into helpless mirth. We'd laughed until our sides ached, until tears gathered at the corners of our eyes, until we were both gasping for breath and looking at each other with the kind of recognition that happens between people who suddenly realize they speak the same unspoken language. Even now, standing in my kitchen with the tea cooling in my hands, I couldn't remember exactly what had been so funny. The details had blurred into something more essential. The sound of Owen's laughter mixing with mine, the way his eyes crinkled when he threw his head back, the sudden intimacy of sharing something purely joyful with another person. It had been so long since I'd laughed like that, with such abandon, such freedom from the careful restraint that had become my default mode. But the laughter had faded now, replaced by something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Owen was still there, still leaning against the counter, but the energy between us had shifted into something I wasn't prepared to name. His voice carried the remnants of our earlier mirth, but underneath it was something else, a warmth that seemed to reach across the kitchen and settle against my skin like a physical presence. He was talking about the book again, something about the way the author handled time and memory, but I found myself listening more to the rhythm of his words than their meaning. Owen had a way of speaking that was both thoughtful and unhurried, as if he genuinely believed that conversations were worth savoring rather than rushing through. It was so different from the efficient exchanges that had come to characterize most of my interactions. The quick coordination with Clara about schedules and responsibilities, the polite small talk with colleagues, the careful distance I maintained with nearly everyone else in my life. I watched him as he spoke, noting details I'd tried not to notice before. The way his dark hair fell slightly across his forehead, the precise movement of his hands as he gestured, the manner in which he seemed completely comfortable in the silence that stretched between his words. There was something about Owen that invited a different kind of attention, a deeper quality of listening that I'd almost forgotten was possible. Then he moved. It was such a simple thing, just pushing off from the counter and crossing the small distance between us to reach for something on the other side of the sink. But as he passed behind me, his arm brushed against mine, and what should have been the briefest, most incidental contact became something else entirely. The touch lingered, just for a moment, just long enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton of my shirt. just long enough for my breath to catch and my pulse to quicken in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with a recognition I'd been trying to avoid for weeks. I felt it like a weight and a spark all at once. The solid presence of another person and the electric possibility of connection. In that moment, the careful boundaries I'd constructed around myself seemed suddenly fragile, arbitrary lines drawn on a map that was being redrawn even as I stood there. The kitchen, which had always been a place of routine and domesticity, transformed into something charged with potential, with the kind of possibility that both terrified and exhilarated me. When Owen finally wrapped his arms around me, it happened so slowly I could have stopped it at any point. I could have stepped away, could have made some joke about the late hour or the wine, could have retreated back into the safe territory of neighborly friendship. But I didn't. I stood there, feeling the weight of his embrace settle around me like something I'd been unconsciously waiting for, something that felt both completely foreign and deeply familiar. His arms encircle me from behind, his chest against my back, his chin resting lightly on my shoulder. It wasn't urgent or demanding. It was careful, almost tentative, as if he too understood that this moment balanced on a knife's edge between friendship and something infinitely more complicated. But it was also unhurried, as if he had no intention of letting go anytime soon, as if he wanted to memorize the feeling of holding me as much as I wanted to memorize the feeling of being held. My first instinct was to pull away, to return to the safe distance that had defined all my relationships for as long as I could remember. Every instinct I'd cultivated over 4 decades of careful living told me to step back, to laugh it off, to pretend this was just the wine and the late hour and the residual warmth of shared laughter. But my body seemed to have other ideas. Instead of pulling away, I found myself leaning back slightly, accepting the weight of Owen's embrace, allowing myself to feel the solid reality of another person choosing to hold me. The tea in my hands had gone cold, but I barely noticed. My mind was scrambling, trying to categorize what was happening, trying to find some framework that would make sense of the way my heart was racing and the way the familiar kitchen had become a stage for something I'd never allowed myself to imagine. But my heart seemed to have found its own anchor in that moment, in the simple and revolutionary act of being held by someone who wanted to hold me. This is where everything began to change. Not in some grand gesture or dramatic declaration, but in a kitchen that smelled of chamomile tea and the faint scent of rain through the window, with 2 men discovering that the space between laughter and longing might be smaller than either of them had ever imagined. In Owen's careful embrace and my decision not to pull away, in the silence that stretched between us like a bridge we were both afraid and eager to cross. I knew, even as I stood there with my cooling tea and my racing heart, that neither of us would see this kitchen the same way again. That something fundamental had shifted, not just between us, but inside me, in places I kept locked and unexamined for so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. The life I'd built so carefully, so deliberately, suddenly felt like a house of cards in a gentle wind. Not destroyed, not yet, but trembling with the possibility of transformation. To understand what that moment in the kitchen meant, you have to understand the life I'd built so carefully, so deliberately over the 43 years that preceded it. I teach high school literature in a town where the morning air carries the permanent scent of salt and rust, where the fog rolls in from the Pacific like clockwork and the lighthouse beam sweeps across my bedroom window every night at precisely 11:47. It's the kind of place people either love with fierce devotion or flee from the moment they turn 18. I'd chosen to stay, though I'm not sure chosen is the right word for something that happened so gradually, so unconsciously. Our house sits 3 blocks from the water, a weathered blue Victorian that Clara and I bought 17 years ago when Naomi was barely walking, and we still believe that the right neighborhood and the right paint color could somehow guarantee happiness. The ivy has grown thick over the years, curling around the porch columns and creeping toward the second-story windows with a persistence that both charms and alarms me. Clara talks about having it trimmed back, but I've grown fond of the way it makes the house feel sheltered protected from the casual scrutiny of neighbors and passersby. Mornings have a ritual quality that I've come to depend on, perhaps more than I should. I wake at 6:15, always 6:15, and pad downstairs to find Clara already moving through the kitchen with the kind of fluid efficiency that comes from years of practice. She hums while she works, old folk songs her mother sang, melodies that drift through the house like something half-remembered from childhood. I pour coffee into the same chipped blue mug I've used for over a decade, fold the newspaper in precise quarters, and we navigate around each other in a dance we've perfected through repetition. Naomi appears at 7:30, all elbows and rolling eyes, and the particular brand of dramatic exasperation that seems endemic to 16-year-old girls. She's beautiful in the unconscious way of teenagers, with Clara's dark hair and something of my tendency toward quiet observation. Watching her rush through breakfast while simultaneously texting friends and complaining about some perceived injustice in her history class, I'm struck by how completely she inhabits her own life, how unquestioningly she assumes the world will bend to accommodate her presence. From the outside, we must appear to be exactly what we are, a stable, middle-class family in a stable, middle-class neighborhood. Clara worked part-time at the library, organizing reading programs, and helping elderly patrons navigate the new computer system. I've taught at the same high school for 15 years, watching waves of students discover Gatsby and Holden Caulfield and Maya Angelou with varying degrees of resistance and revelation. We attend the occasional town council meeting, host Naomi's friends for movie nights, contribute casseroles to potluck dinners at the community center. But underneath this carefully maintained surface, I've been aware for years of a steady undercurrent of dissonance, a quiet grief for something I couldn't name or locate. It's not that I'm unhappy, exactly. That would be too simple, too easily addressed. It's more like living slightly out of phase with my own life, as if I'm watching someone who looks like me go through the motions of being Julia Mercer, while the real me observes from some impossible distance. My friendships, such as they are, carry the polite restraint that seems to characterize most adult relationships in small towns. We discuss the weather and local politics and our children's achievements with practiced ease, but there's always an invisible line that no one crosses, a careful boundary between public self and private truth. I play my role, concerned parent, dedicated teacher, reliable neighbor, with what I've been told is admirable consistency. But the performance has become so habitual that I sometimes wonder if there's anything authentic left underneath it. In the evenings, after Naomi has retreated to her room and Clara has settled in her chair with a book or her laptop, I often find myself in my small study, surrounded by the books I've accumulated like other people accumulate photographs or souvenirs. Reading has always been my most reliable escape, the one place where I can inhabit other lives, other possibilities, without the risk of disrupting the careful equilibrium I've worked so hard to maintain. But lately, even books have begun to feel insufficient, like looking at the world through glass that's gradually becoming more opaque. It's in those small hours, when the house settles around me and a lighthouse beam marks time across the wall, that I allow myself to feel the loneliness fully. Not the surface loneliness of needing company or conversation, but something deeper, the loneliness of living at a remove from my own authentic self, of having spent so many years being who I thought I should be that I'd almost forgotten who I actually was. The kitchen has become a kind of barometer for these feelings. Bright and bustling in the mornings, filled with Clara's humming and Naomi's chatter and the comfortable chaos of family life. It transforms in the evening hours into something quieter, more reflective. It's where I go when I can't sleep, where I make tea, I don't drink, and stand at the window watching the street lamps create pools of yellow light on the empty sidewalk. It has become, without my fully realizing it, the stage for all the conversations I never have, with Clara, with myself, with the possibilities I've been too careful to explore. 3 months ago, Owen Callahan moved into the house next door, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began entering that stage without asking permission. At first, he was just another neighbor, the kind of polite stranger you wave to while getting the mail or acknowledge with a nod while walking to your car. But there was something about Owen that invited a different quality of attention, something that suggested depth beneath the surface politeness that governs most casual interactions. He was younger than me by nearly a decade, recently divorced, with a kind of quiet confidence that seemed genuinely unbothered by the rhythms and expectations of small-town life. Where most newcomers either tried too hard to fit in or maintained an obvious distance from local customs, Owen seemed to navigate both intimacy and independence with equal ease. And somehow, without either of us quite planning it, he had begun to matter in ways that made my carefully ordered life feel suddenly, dangerously open to change. Our first real conversation happened over a shared fence on a Saturday morning in late September, when the air had just begun to carry that particular crispness that signals the end of summer. I was in the backyard, half-heartedly pulling weeds from the flower bed that Clara had planted with such optimism the previous spring, when I heard Owen's voice from the other side of the weathered cedar fence that separated our properties. He needed to borrow a ladder, he said. Something about a loose shutter that had been rattling in the ocean breeze, keeping him awake at night. His voice carried an easy familiarity, as if we'd been neighbors for years rather than strangers who'd barely exchanged more than polite nods in passing. When I brought the ladder around his side of the fence, I found him standing in his backyard wearing paint-stained jeans and a gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up, looking at his house with a kind of thoughtful assessment that suggested someone who actually saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than burdens to be endured. That simple favor led to others. A cup of sugar when the grocery store was closed. Help moving a heavy bookshelf that had been delivered to the wrong address. The loan of jumper cables on a morning when his car wouldn't start. Small, neighborly exchanges that gradually accumulated into something more substantial. Not friendship, exactly, but the beginning of genuine familiarity. Owen had a way of asking for help that made it feel like a gift rather than an imposition, and I found myself looking forward to these brief interruptions in my routine more than I cared to admit. The invitation came on a Thursday evening in mid-October during one of those autumn storms that roll in from the Pacific with theatrical intensity. Rain was hammering against the windows with a persistence that made staying indoors feel like both necessity and luxury. Clara had driven to her sister's house 2 towns over, something about helping plan their mother's birthday celebration, and Naomi was spending the night at a friend's house, working on some group project that involved more giggling than actual studying. I was grading papers at the kitchen table, surrounded by coffee-stained essays about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, when Owen knocked on the door. He stood on my front porch looking slightly apologetic, rain dripping from his dark hair, holding a bottle of wine in one hand and what appeared to be a casserole dish in the other. He'd made too much dinner, he said, some kind of pasta dish with vegetables from his small garden, and it seemed foolish to let it go to waste. Would I be interested in joining him? The invitation was casual, almost offhand, but something in his expression suggested it mattered more than his tone indicated. I accepted without hesitation, telling myself it was simple neighborly politeness, but knowing even then that my eagerness had less to do with being polite and more to do with the prospect of spending an evening in Owen's company. His house was smaller than mine, a modest bungalow that had been built in the 1930s and still carried traces of its original character. Where my home felt carefully curated, maintained according to Clara's sense of what a family house should look like. Owen's felt lived in, comfortable in its imperfections. Mismatched plates, books stacked on every available surface, a record player in the corner of the kitchen playing something low and jazzy that I didn't recognize but immediately wanted to hear again. The food was simple but thoughtful, penne with roasted vegetables and herbs that tasted like they'd been picked that afternoon. We ate at his small wooden table while the storm continued its assault on the windows, and somehow the conversation flowed with the same effortless quality that had characterized all our previous interactions. We talked about books, discovering a shared appreciation for authors who wrote about loneliness and longing with unflinching honesty. We talked about the ocean, about growing up in places where the horizon seemed to stretch into infinity. We talked about the strange experience of reaching middle age and realizing that the life you'd built might not be the life you'd actually chosen. It was that last conversation that shifted something fundamental between us. Owen spoke about his divorce with a kind of clear-eyed assessment that suggested someone who'd done the hard work of understanding his own role in the failure. He'd married young, he said, to someone who wanted the same things he thought he wanted: security, respectability, the kind of predictable happiness that looks so appealing from the outside. But living it had felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, a constant awareness of constraint and compromise that had gradually worn away at both of them until they barely recognized each other. I found myself talking about things I'd never said aloud before, about the feeling of living slightly outside my own life, of going through motions that had once felt meaningful but had gradually become mechanical, about loving Clara and Naomi, but sometimes feeling like I was playing a role rather than inhabiting my authentic self, about the quiet desperation that came with realizing you might spend your entire life being someone you weren't sure you actually were. As the evening progressed and the storm showed no signs of abating, Owen insisted I wait it out rather than walking home through the driving rain. We moved from the kitchen to his small living room, where he built a fire in the stone fireplace, and we continued talking with the kind of unguarded honesty that usually only emerges between people who've known each other for years. The wine had loosened something in both of us, but it wasn't just the alcohol. It was the rare luxury of being truly heard by another person, of speaking into a space where judgment seemed impossible and understanding felt effortless. When I finally returned home near midnight, the storm had passed, and the air smelled of wet earth and possibility. I stood in my own kitchen, so familiar yet somehow transformed by contrast, and realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just between Owen and me, but in my understanding of what conversation could be, what connection felt like when it wasn't filtered through the careful restraint that had governed most of my adult relationships. From that night forward, something in me began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden revelation or moment of clarity that changed everything at once. Instead, it was like watching a photograph develop slowly in a darkroom, familiar shapes gradually emerging for what had previously been blank space. I started finding reasons to be outside when I heard Owen's car in the driveway, timing my evening walks to coincide with his return from work, lingering by the mailbox with letters I'd already read just for the chance of casual conversation. The conversations themselves began to stretch longer, evolving from brief exchanges over the fence into something more substantial. We'd find ourselves leaning against the weathered cedar boards that separated our properties, talking as the sun set behind the houses and the streetlights flickered on one by one. Sometimes he'd appear on his back porch with 2 bottles of beer, wordlessly offering one across the fence as if this had always been our routine. Other evenings, when the Pacific fog rolled in thick and damp, we'd sit on his front steps or mine, listening to the foghorns in the distance and letting comfortable silences stretch between us. There was something about Owen's way of listening that I'd never encountered before. He didn't rush to fill pauses with his own thoughts or experiences, didn't treat conversation like a competition where the goal was to prove how well he understood or how much he had to contribute. Instead, he created space for hesitation, for half-formed thoughts, for the kind of meandering reflection that required patience from both speaker and listener. In his presence, I began to hear my own voice differently, as if I were finally saying things I'd been thinking for years without realizing it. At school, I found my attention wandering in ways that both concerned and exhilarated me. Standing before my third-period American literature class, discussing Thoreau's meditation on solitude and self-reliance, I'd catch myself remembering something Owen had said about the ocean always making him feel both smaller and more significant at the same time. While my students worked through their analysis of Whitman's catalogs, I'd replay moments from our conversations. The way he'd pause before talking about his marriage, the careful honesty with which he described feeling like a stranger in his own life. Clara began to notice my distraction, though she interpreted it through the familiar lens of work-related stress. She'd ask if I was sleeping well, if the new curriculum requirements were causing problems, if I needed help grading papers or preparing lessons. Her concern was genuine and familiar, the kind of solicitous attention that had characterized our marriage for years. But I found myself unable to explain what was actually happening, partly because I didn't fully understand it myself, and partly because speaking aloud would make it real in ways I wasn't prepared for. One Saturday in early November, Owen appeared at my door asking for help with a project. He was repainting his bedroom, something he'd been putting off since moving in, and wondered if I might be willing to lend a hand. The room needed 2 coats, he said, and the work would go faster with 2 people. Clara had taken Naomi shopping for winter clothes, leaving me with an unexpectedly free afternoon and no reasonable excuse to decline. We spent the entire day in that small room, moving around each other with a kind of quiet synchronicity that felt both natural and charged with unspoken awareness. Owen had chosen a warm gray for the walls, something that would make the space feel larger and catch the morning light from the single east-facing window. We worked mostly in comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft whisper of brushes against plaster and the distant crash of waves against the rocks below town. There was something meditative about the work, something that allowed conversation to flow without the weight of direct eye contact or the pressure of formal interaction. We talked about teaching, about books we'd loved as children, about the strange intimacy of living so close to the ocean that its rhythms began to regulate your own internal clock. Owen mentioned that he'd started swimming in the mornings, walking down to the small cove beyond the lighthouse and entering the cold Pacific water as the sun came up. The image stayed with me, Owen's dark silhouette against the gray water, the courage required to immerse yourself in something that vast and unforgiving. As the afternoon progressed, our movements around each other became more fluid, more unconsciously coordinated. When Owen needed to reach a high corner, I'd automatically move aside. When I bent to refill my paint tray, he'd step around me without looking. The dance of shared labor in a small space created its own intimacy, a physical awareness that felt both innocent and dangerous. It was while I was painting the trim around the window that the moment happened, the one I would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. Owen was behind me, working on the wall near the door, when he noticed a smear of paint on my forearm. Without thinking, he reached out and brushed it away with his thumb, the contact lasting just long enough for both of us to register its significance. His skin was warm against mine, slightly rough from the work, and when he didn't immediately pull his hand away, something in the air between us shifted again. We stood there for what couldn't have been more than a few seconds, paint brushes forgotten in our other hands, the afternoon light streaming through the window and casting everything in golden relief. Owen's eyes met mine with an expression I recognized but couldn't yet name. Part question, part acknowledgement, part invitation to something neither of us was ready to define. Then the moment passed. He smiled, made some comment about paint getting everywhere, and we returned to our work. But the room felt different afterward, charged with the recognition that we were painting over more than just old walls. Walking home that evening, my clothes speckled with gray paint and my hands still carrying the ghost of Owen's touch, I understood that something irreversible was happening. The careful boundaries of my life, between neighbor and friend, between companionship and longing, between the person I'd always been and the person I might become, were being quietly but persistently redrawn. The revelation came not as I'd imagined it might, not in some dramatic moment of confession or clarity, but in a single, irreversible instant that changed everything while appearing to change nothing at all. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, when the days had grown short and the Pacific storms arrived with increasing frequency. Clara had taken Naomi to visit her grandmother, something about helping the older woman organize her medications and ensuring she was prepared for the approaching winter. They wouldn't be back until late, Clara had said, kissing my cheek with the distracted affection of someone already mentally rehearsing the evening's responsibilities. I'd been grading papers in my study when I heard Owen's knock, 3 soft raps that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. He stood on my front porch holding a grocery bag and wearing the kind of slightly sheepish expression that suggested he'd been debating whether to come over at all. He'd bought too much food again, he explained, a recurring theme that had become our unspoken excuse for spending time together. Will I be interested in helping him cook dinner? The question carried the same casual tone as all his previous invitations, but something in his eyes suggested this evening might be different. We moved through my kitchen with the easy familiarity that had developed over our weeks of increasing friendship. Owen had brought ingredients for something ambitious: fresh pasta that required rolling by hand, vegetables that needed careful preparation, herbs that filled the room with the scent of summer gardens despite the November chill outside. We worked side by side, our movements unconsciously coordinated in the way that had become natural during our afternoon painting his bedroom. The laughter started over something completely ordinary. Owen was attempting to explain his theory about why restaurant pasta never tasted as good as what you could make at home, gesturing with flour-covered hands while I tried to keep the conversation going despite being distracted by the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned over the cutting board. His explanation became increasingly elaborate and ridiculous, involving complex conspiracies among commercial pasta manufacturers and the secret pasta-making techniques of Italian grandmothers, until we were both laughing so hard we could barely continue cooking. It was the same kind of helpless, joyful laughter we'd shared that first night months ago, but deeper now, more intimate. We laughed until our sides ached, until tears gathered at the corners of our eyes, until the vegetables sat forgotten on the cutting board and the pasta water boiled over onto the stove. But underneath the humor was something else, a current of recognition, of shared understanding that went beyond whatever had sparked our mirth. As our laughter gradually subsided, Owen moved to turn down the burner, reaching past me to adjust the flame. It should have been a simple gesture, the kind of unconscious navigation that happens between people sharing small space. But as he leaned across me, his hand came to rest at my waist, just above my hip, steadying himself, or perhaps steadying us both. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it didn't withdraw. I felt the weight of his palm through my shirt, the warmth of his fingers against my side, and something in me went very still. Not the stillness of fear or uncertainty, but the stillness of recognition, of finally arriving at a destination I'd been unconsciously moving toward for months without allowing myself to acknowledge it. The laughter faded from the room, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the whole house was holding its breath. Owen's eyes searched mine, not for permission, but for recognition, the unspoken acknowledgement that this moment had been building between us through every conversation, every shared silence, every casual touch that had lingered just a fraction longer than necessity required. His hand remained at my waist, neither pressing forward nor pulling away, as if he understood that whatever happened next needed to come from both of us simultaneously. When he finally pulled me into an embrace, it happened with the same careful deliberation that had characterized all our interactions. His arms encircled me slowly, giving me every opportunity to step away, to laugh it off, to return to the safe territory of friendship and neighborly affection. But I didn't step away. Instead, I found myself leaning into the solid warmth of his chest, my hands coming up to rest against his shoulders, accepting what was being offered while offering something in return. The embrace was both careful and desperate, as though he was afraid that letting go would mean the end of whatever we just found, but also afraid that holding on too tightly might break something fragile and newly formed. I could feel his heartbeat against my chest, quick and uncertain, matching the rhythm of my own. His chin rested against my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck, and for the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt completely present in my own body, completely alive to the moment I was actually living. In that instant, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing could go back to how it was. Not my marriage, not my carefully constructed life, not the person I'd been pretending to be for so long, I'd almost convinced myself it was real. The kitchen around us, my kitchen, with its familiar appliances and comfortable routines, had become a different place entirely, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. I felt terror and relief and a strange, aching joy all tangled together in my chest. Terror at the implications of what was happening, relief at finally stopping the exhausting performance of being someone I wasn't, and joy at the discovery that connection like this was actually possible, that another person could see me clearly and choose to hold me anyway. Standing there in Owen's arms, with the pasta water still bubbling on the stove and the vegetables waiting to be finished, I understood that I'd been living my entire life at a remove from myself. And at this moment, dangerous and uncertain as it was, felt like the first authentic thing I'd experienced in years. In the days that followed, my world began to split in two, each half existing in sharp contrast to the other. There was the life at home with Clara and Naomi, filled with the familiar rhythms of morning coffee and evening news, homework supervision, and weekend errands. And there was the pull toward Owen, toward conversations that lasted until midnight and silences that felt more intimate than words. Living between these two realities required a kind of emotional compartmentalization I'd never had to practice before, and the effort left me feeling simultaneously hyper-aware and completely disconnected from everything I'd once taken for granted. Clara began to sense the change before I fully understood it myself. Her questions grew sharper, though still wrapped in the language of concern rather than suspicion. Was I feeling well? Was work becoming too stressful? Had something happened that I wanted to talk about? She'd always been perceptive, attuned to shifts in mood and energy that I thought I'd hidden successfully. But now her attention felt like a searchlight, illuminating corners of myself I wasn't ready to examine. The silences between us grew longer, weighted with unspoken knowledge. Conversations that had once flowed easily became careful negotiations around subjects we both sensed were dangerous. Clara would start to ask something, then stop herself, her words hanging unfinished in the air between us. I found myself doing the same thing, beginning sentences about my day, then realizing I couldn't mention Owen without revealing too much, couldn't describe my thoughts without exposing the direction they'd been traveling. Meanwhile, my connection with Owen deepened in ways that felt both inevitable and impossible. We hadn't spoken directly about what had happened in the kitchen that evening, but something fundamental had shifted between us. Our conversations carried a new weight, a recognition that we were no longer simply neighbors who'd become friends. When he looked at me, I saw questions in his eyes that matched the ones I was afraid to ask myself. When our hands brushed reaching for the same book or passing a cup of coffee, the contact lingered in ways that felt both accidental and entirely deliberate. One evening in early December, as Clara and I sat in our living room reading, she with a mystery novel, me with student papers I couldn't concentrate on, she set down her book and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or suspicion, but something more complex, a kind of tired recognition, as if she'd been waiting for this moment longer than either of us realized. "Is there someone else?" she asked. The words fell into the quiet room with the weight of something that had been building for weeks, maybe months. She didn't sound accusatory or dramatic, just weary, as if the question had been taking up so much space in her mind that finally speaking it aloud came as a relief. I didn't answer immediately. In that pause, which couldn't have lasted more than a few seconds but felt like an eternity, I understood that Clara already knew. Not the details, perhaps, but the essential truth that I'd been trying to hide from both of us. The pause stretched between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross, but couldn't avoid any longer. When I finally spoke, it wasn't to deny her suspicion or to offer reassurances I couldn't honestly give. Instead, I found myself saying that things had become complicated, that I was struggling with feelings I didn't fully understand, that I didn't want to hurt her, but wasn't sure how to avoid it. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had, quiet, careful, filled with the kind of honesty that's only possible when both people understand that everything is about to change. Clara listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Then she said something that surprised me. She'd sensed for years that part of me had always seemed elsewhere, as if I were living slightly outside my own life. She'd attributed it to work stress, to the natural evolution of long marriages, to a dozen explanations that felt more comfortable than the truth she was now being forced to confront. That weekend, Clara took Naomi to visit her sister, ostensibly for an early Christmas celebration, but really, I suspected, to give us both space to think. The house felt different with them gone, not just quieter, but somehow more honest, as if the walls themselves could finally stop maintaining the pretense that everything was normal. It was on the second evening of their absence that I walked down to the pier at dusk, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. The December air was sharp with salt and the promise of rain, gulls circling overhead in patterns that seemed both random and purposeful. I found Owen there, standing at the far end of the wooden planks with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the horizon where the last light was fading from the sky. He didn't seem surprised to see me, as if he'd been waiting without knowing exactly what he was waiting for. We stood side by side for a while, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the water in its eternal rotation, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. The air between us was charged with all the conversations we hadn't had, all the questions we hadn't asked, all the possibilities we'd been circling around for months. When Owen finally spoke, it wasn't to ask what I decided or to push for answers I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply said that whatever I needed, whatever time I required to figure things out, he would wait. But I could see the question in his eyes, the same question that had been building in my own chest since that evening in the kitchen. In that suspended moment, with the ocean stretching endlessly before us and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, I made a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. It was simply an acknowledgement of what had already happened, what had been happening slowly and inevitably for months. I reached for Owen's hand in the open air, something we'd never done before, something that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. The choice was not without cost. I understood that even as my fingers intertwined with his. But it was a choice toward truth, toward the possibility of living authentically rather than safely, toward becoming the person I'd been afraid to be for 43 years. 8 months later, I find myself standing in the same kitchen where everything began, but the room has been transformed by absence and possibility in equal measure. The house is quieter now, not the oppressive quiet of things left unsaid, but the peaceful quiet of space that no longer needs to hold secrets. Clara has been living with her sister since February, a temporary arrangement that has gradually become permanent without either of us needing to discuss the finality of it. Naomi visits on weekends, her initial anger and confusion slowly giving way to something that might eventually become acceptance, though I know that healing will take years rather than months. The ivy outside has grown thicker over the spring and summer, curling more insistently around the porch columns and reaching toward the second-story windows with an ambition that both charms and concerns me. Clara had always wanted it trimmed back, but I've grown to love the way it makes the house feel sheltered, protected not from scrutiny now, but simply embraced by something wild and persistent. The lighthouse beam still sweeps across my bedroom window at 11:47 each night, but I no longer lie awake counting its rotations. Instead, I sleep the deep sleep of someone who no longer needs to maintain careful distances from his own life. I'm making tea in the same chipped blue mug I've used for over a decade, stirring honey I can actually taste this time, when Owen enters through the back door without knocking. This has become our routine. He keeps a key now, moves through the space with the easy familiarity of someone who belongs here, who has gradually and naturally become part of the daily rhythms that define this place. He sets 2 mugs on the counter, begins talking about something ordinary, a book he finished reading last night, something about a character who spends his whole life thinking he's living someone else's story before realizing that every story is exactly as real as you make it. The conversation drifts easily from books to the tide schedule Owen checks each morning, planning his daily swim in the cove beyond the lighthouse. He's been swimming year-round now, even through the coldest months of winter, and his descriptions of the water's changing moods have become one of my favorite parts of our morning talks. There's something about his relationship with the ocean that speaks to a kind of courage I'm still learning to cultivate. The willingness to immerse yourself completely in something vast and unpredictable, trusting that you'll find your way back to shore. We don't touch at first, moving around each other in the familiar dance of two people who share space comfortably. Owen reaches for the sugar. I adjust the flame under the kettle. He pulls down plates for the toast he's already decided to make, even though neither of us is particularly hungry. These small domestic choreographies have become precious to me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The simple luxury of moving through daily routines with someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway. When Owen moves past me to reach for something in the cabinet above the sink, his hand brushes mine and stays there a moment longer than necessary. It's such a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone watching from outside, but it carries the weight of everything we've built together over these months of gradual transformation. His touch no longer feels like a question or a surprise. It feels like coming home to yourself after a very long journey. The rain starts outside, tapping against the windows with a gentle persistence that means it will continue for hours. Pacific storms in late summer are different from their winter counterparts. Less dramatic, more contemplative, the kind of weather that makes staying indoors feel like a choice rather than a necessity. I lean back slightly against Owen's chest, accepting the weight of his presence, the reality of being held by someone who knows exactly who I am and wants to hold me anyway. Standing here in this kitchen that has witnessed so much change, I'm struck by how little the external details matter and how much the internal landscape has been transformed. The same counters, the same appliances, the same chipped mug, and familiar morning light streaming through windows that have framed countless ordinary moments. But everything feels different now. Not because the room has changed, but because I've finally learned to inhabit my own life authentically. I think about Julian from a year ago, standing in this same spot stirring tea he couldn't taste, living at a careful remove from his own experience, maintaining the performance of being someone he thought he should be. That version of myself feels like a character from a book I once read. Real enough, but somehow insubstantial, existing more in the imagination than in the world of immediate experience. The transformation hasn't been without cost. Naomi still looks at me, sometimes with a mixture of love and bewilderment, trying to reconcile the father she thought she knew with a man who upended everything she'd understood about family and stability. Clara and I maintain a careful politeness when we need to coordinate about Naomi's needs, but I can see in her eyes the recognition that I've become someone she never really knew, perhaps someone I never really was during our years together. But there's also been unexpected grace. In choosing truth over safety, in allowing myself to love and be loved without pretense, I've discovered possibilities I never imagined existed. The simple miracle of waking up each day in a life that actually belongs to me, of moving through routines that feel genuine rather than performed, of experiencing connection that doesn't require me to edit or diminish essential parts of myself. Owen's arms encircle me from behind, the same careful embrace that changed everything months ago in this very kitchen, but easier now, more certain. Outside, the rain continues its gentle conversation with the windows, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear the foghorn that means the morning mist is rolling in from the ocean. Everything feels exactly as it should, not perfect, not without complexity or challenge, but real in ways that make even the difficulties feel like honest engagement with life rather than elaborate avoidance of it. The faintest smile touches my lips as I settle more completely into Owen's embrace, into this moment, into the life I've finally learned to claim as my own.